we know for a fact that these regimes are also sponsoring terrorist activities. So there is a clear decision that's been made in the sense that we have continued to maintain ties with these regimes, knowing full well what's going on. The other issue is that not only have we done that, we've actually gone further than that. In order to control hydrocarbon energy resources and to extend that control, we've actually got more involved in the sponsorship of those groups and used them deliberately as mercenary proxy force in order to destabilize certain strategic regions that are either access routes to this kind of energy or actually hold that kind of energy. The policy of using proxy forces has happened in many regions. One of the most obvious examples is in Afghanistan, where we know this happened during the Cold War. The US funded Osama bin Laden and his Mujahideen in order to counter the Soviet Union, the pretext being that we were fighting international communism. The wider context that we are not always familiar with is that Afghanistan has a very important geostrategic position in the international system, and this has been expressed by many experts in geopolitics. One of the most influential is Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was National Security Advisor to President Carter and more recently an unofficial advisor to President Obama. He wrote a book called The Grand Chessboard, where he emphasized Afghanistan's relationship to the wider Eurasian continent in terms of an access point, and that maintaining control of Eurasia is instrumental to maintaining US hegemony in general. Brzezinski was also instrumental in kickstarting the policy of funding bin Laden and the Mujahideen in order to kick the Soviets out of Afghanistan, whose presence would have undermined US control in the region. But that relationship didn't end in Afghanistan at the end of the Cold War. The conventional opinion is that the US disconnected from bin Laden, he turned against the West, started bombing Western targets, and that this escalated until 9/11, at which point we had to respond in the form of the War on Terror. There are broad areas of that narrative that I might say are correct, but there are fundamental problems with it. And one of the most fundamental problems is that we never really disconnected from Osama bin Laden. This has been corroborated by a number of intelligence experts. One of the most well-known is Sibel Edmonds, who after 9/11 was translating hundreds of pre-9/11 intelligence documents for the FBI. And she has confirmed that Osama bin Laden and the Taliban were sponsored by US intelligence services all the way up to 9/11 at the very least. She was interviewed behind closed doors by the 9/11 Commission, but none of her testimony made it into the public record, and she has been repeatedly gagged by the US government and risks imprisonment for speaking out. What this shows us is that due to our rabid overdependence on fossil fuels, we have become very used to using terrorist groups to destabilize certain strategic regions in order to integrate them into the global political economy and access their valuable resources.
Now that the risks have been taken, now that the pioneering has been done, the way is open for other American companies to come into the Middle East and join in developing its great resources for the benefit of its people and of the world.
The West has been manipulating these groups for very specific geopolitical interests. We know that this was happening with the sponsorship of the Taliban all the way through the 1990s, with the primary interest being that the Taliban would pave the way for sufficient stability to have a trans-Afghan gas pipeline route to Central Asian resources. The envisaged pipeline that would run through Afghanistan was supposed to be a way of accessing largely at that time unexplored reserves of oil and gas in the Caspian Sea, and it would cut across Pakistan, bypass Russia, and it would bypass Iran and transport this gas to Western markets. What we find is that in late 2000, the US government started to have doubts about the Taliban's ability to really pull this off. And this was because the Taliban was fighting a civil war with the Northern Alliance for which there was no end in sight. So from the year 2000 to 2001, the United States government convened a series of meetings and negotiations with the Taliban. The Taliban were basically told, you're not going to have a stable government by yourself. The Northern Alliance is continuing to fight with you. We need you to join up with the Northern Alliance, form a federal government. And if you do that, you'll get all the aid, you'll get international legitimacy, and we can continue with the gas pipeline. And the Taliban, being the hardliners that they were, said, no, thanks. We are the legitimate representative government of Afghanistan, we believe, and we're going to stay where we are. And 3 months before 9/11 was when the last meeting occurred, and the Taliban boycotted this meeting, but they were represented by Pakistani Foreign Minister Niaz Naik, who confirmed that the United States government had proposed to the Taliban that if they didn't comply with this federalization plan, that there would be military action to eliminate the Taliban, and that this action would occur by around mid-October that year, which is exactly when the war in Afghanistan actually occurred. The phrase that was used was that they would get either a carpet of gold or a carpet of bombs. And what this shows us is that the war in Afghanistan was not about fighting terrorism. It was not even a direct response to 9/11. It was already being planned. 9/11 just provided the pretext, and it was much more to do with accessing regional resources than anything to do with human rights or fighting terrorism. And now you see with the escalation of the war in Afghanistan, right now US and British forces are trying to expel the Taliban from the southern region of Afghanistan, which is precisely where the Trans-Afghan pipeline is supposed to run. What we can say with certainty, and I prefer to stick to what we can say with absolute certainty, is that the system generates terrorism as a phenomenon, that terrorism has become integral to the way the system works. And this justifies the state's militarization of foreign policy, and it also justifies the state's increasingly draconian treatment of its own citizens. Overall, we are facing these multiple converging crises. Climate change, energy, food, the economy, and even terrorism, all of which are escalating. What's happening in this context is that rather than dealing with the root structural causes of these crises, which are often rooted in state policies and interstate policies, what you're seeing instead is states are much more able and willing to maximize their military capacity to maintain the structure of an unequal global economic system, often using terrorism as a justification. And we find that a parallel process is happening domestically. Governments are increasingly enacting more and more legislation that encroaches on civil liberties, that allows them to survey communities, monitor people's lives, their ability to control their populations, their ability to counteract the rise of dissident movements.
Civil defense is government operating in an emergency. By 10:55, the heads of utilities, Red Cross, military liaison, Civil Air Patrol, Weather Bureau, and all city departments are functioning as a civil defense team.
When you look at some of the defence planning documents that have been released from the British, from the European Union, from the United States, planning documents created by defence planners, people working in the military, what's interesting about the documents is that a lot of them show that many of the people working on national security are aware of some of these crises. They are looking at climate change and they're saying climate change is going to be a problem. They're looking at food shortages, they're looking at energy shortages, they're looking at water shortages, and they're saying there's going to be massive stress. It's important to understand that the people creating these plans work in the military. They're not necessarily part of a big conspiracy of any kind. They're on a salary and they're told, okay, look at these crises, find out what's going on, let's think about it. What's driving this process of militarization is a very narrow lens of looking at the world. And again, it does come back to these implicit assumptions about how the world works, these neoliberal ideas about us living in the most advanced system possible. So what you find is that when you have all of these implicit assumptions about the way the world works, and then you're coming at it from a military angle, which is all about, well, we need to defend this society against new threats, then the only way you can respond to it, if you're going to look at it from that angle, is with guns. Even though guns are never going to solve your problem, because you can't deal with economics with guns. You can't deal with melting glaciers with guns. You can't deal with the fact that you're depleting your oil reserves with guns. But when you've paid a couple of defense planners, then they're only going to come up with solutions based on guns because that's all they know.
The time is 11:10. This is an official civil defense broadcast. Keep your radio tuned to this frequency.
In the UK, we have what is called the Civil Contingencies Act, which passed in 2004. The government now has extraordinary powers, which it can impose on its own will if it considers that there is a national emergency. Now, what's worrying is that the things that the government is able to do in the context of such an emergency are really extraordinary. So they could confiscate property, anybody's property. They can set up new courts outside of the existing judicial system to pass judgment on things. They can cancel elections. They can set up curfews whenever they feel like, so to stop people from traveling at certain times. They can cordon off entire public areas and simply prevent people from accessing them. They can arrest people and detain them for any duration of time. What it basically does is pave the way to a full-on authoritarian state and the end of democracy. Some people might think that I'm being alarmist, but it is alarming, and I think we should all be alarmed because the legislation really speaks for itself.
And so this day called X, which began in such an ordinary way, is no ordinary day. At 10:35, the banshee wail of the siren echoes the warning, and the city prepares for survival.
These powers have nothing to do with responding effectively in a robust way to national emergencies. When you look at what the government should be doing in terms of looking locally, assessing the different kinds of risks, looking at what facilities and infrastructures are existing in different parts of the country, what do we need to do to increase the capacity of our facilities to respond effectively to real emergencies? What is the government actually doing on the ground to make us empowered to respond properly and appropriately? Nothing is happening. The government's not doing anything. There's no investment. There's no real analysis. There are some processes in place, but it's very, very minimal. So when you compare that level of inaction with the huge level of interest in maximizing the state's powers, their police powers, their military powers, and their powers of social control, there's this massive gulf. And it's very clear to me that